I think we can get started. I mean, the first part will just be done by me, but it's not the essential part of the webinar. So I will share my screen. Are you guys able to see it? Excellent, good. So warm welcome to this third session, this third quarterly Young WFNR research webinar. It's my pleasure as chair of the Young WFNR Special Interest Group within the World Federation for Neurorehabilitation to welcome you to this one. The idea of these the Young WFNR research webinars is that young or early career researchers can present their work, can gain exposure, and can gain valuable input, valuable feedback from invited international renowned experts in their respective field. But of course, it's also that that they can connect with members of the audience, that the audience also has some fascinating talks to follow up to. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this one. We have two very exciting talks ahead of us, and I'm also very happy to welcome Professor Hermano Igor Krebs and Dr. Annie Hill to this webinar. So first, I will direct a short word of welcome, which we're currently at. Then this talk will be followed by a talk from Amalric Ortlieb about the physical rehabilitation challenges and opportunities of wearable exoskeletons from an engineer perspective. This will be commented upon in the discussion section by Professor Hermano Igor Krebs. And then we will have the second talk from Carl Froilan, physiatrist from the Philippines, about responding to the needs of the time through telerehabilitation experience from a resource-limited country. So let me just briefly introduce the invited experts. So I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Hermano Igor Krebs. He's a worldwide renowned expert in the field of robotic rehabilitation. He's the principal research scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the United States, and also adjunct professor of the University of Maryland School in Medicine. And next to, of course, the neurorehabilitation, the robotics in neurorehabilitation, he is active in human-robot interaction, human augmentation, even agricultural robotics. I had the chance to meet him at a past WCNR, and even sat on the at the same table as him during the social event, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome him here. I'm also thrilled to welcome Dr. Annie Hill. I unfortunately haven't met her in person at the WCNR in Vienna last year, but I invited her nonetheless to comment upon the speech from Carl Froilan. So Annie Hill is a senior research fellow in speech pathology at the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences at the University of Queensland and Metro North Health in Australia. Due to the time differences, due to the time zones, she cannot join in person, but she has pre-recorded her discussion part for Carl's lecture, which will be played back after Carl's lecture. She is the founding member of the Center for Research in Telerehabilitation and has been spearheading telerehabilitation and speech pathology, and is also the Special Interest Group Chair of the WFNR Telerehabilitation Special Interest Group. So before we get started, I'd just like to point out to the next quarterly research webinar, which will be held on May 3rd in 2023, so in 3 months' time. When you're interested as a member of the audience, when you're interested to present your research, you can always write to me and we will set you up and organize an international expert for you to comment upon your research. But now let's get started. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Amalric Ortlieb. He is an engineer from Switzerland. He studied medical engineering at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, the EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland, and specialized in robotics, mainly mechanical design and control. After the study, he started a PhD at the Formal Lab of Robotics Swiss Federal Institute of Technology under Professor Hans Bleuler, which is today called ReAssist and led by Dr. Mohamed Bouri. After he did a postdoc with Professor Andrea Serino at the University Hospital in Lausanne, Switzerland, and was one of the founding members of Autonomio, of a startup including exoskeletons and neurorehabilitation. I'm also very excited to hear more about this. His talk will be entitled Physical Rehabilitation Challenges and Opportunities of Wearable Exoskeletons from an Engineer Perspective. And so I'd like to give the floor up to Amorik. Very happy to have you here. And yeah, I'm excited for your talk.
Thank you very much, Elia. I think not now completely. You should soon be able to see my screen with the good topic. Is that good?
Excellent.
Great. So yeah, today we're going to talk about the lower limb exoskeleton, specific perspective on our venture, that is Autonomio, the way we do things, our early results, and also a bit more generally, the field of lower limb exoskeletons and where it's going. As an introduction, I would present mostly physical rehabilitation, the way it's done, to understand how it evolves, etc. In classical physiotherapy, the main thing that you need mostly is a physical support to perform a motion. And they have demonstrated that one of the major impacts or benefits of a therapy is the number of repetitions you can do. And of course, you can see with this patient, for example, that you need almost 2 persons taking care of 2 things. The first one, we will say it's balance control, and the other one is physical support to perform the same motion. You have more complex clinics with more complex handling of the patients. For example, here, I think I have the Helen Hayes Hospital in the US, and they demonstrate how they use a treadmill plus a bodyweight support plus a few physiotherapists to bring the motion. So this is a bit of an overkill, but you can see to what extent you can provide better or globally extended care. In the early nounis, they started with different devices that we called robotically assisted gait training. I think the first one and the most renowned one still today is the Locomat from Hokoma. So this is a device mounted with a frame on a treadmill where the motion is completely provided, but what we already called at this stage an exoskeleton. We then went from other devices that have also some kind of very interesting benefits. We call them end effector, because instead of moving the full limbs of the patients, they're just attached to, for example, the foot, and they're just moving those ones. What's interesting here, for example, is that the management of the transition of the weight support has to be done by the patient, meaning that he needs to load the left and the right foot one after the other, and this is not provided like it was for the Locomat, for example. Going in the field of today, a bit more lower limb exoskeleton. So that's an extension of what we've seen just before, but without any frame or support around it. You have an example of the 2 pioneers exoskeleton, let's say, companies that are Rewalk and Exo. First one, I mean, both of them were basically firstly targeting SCI patients, so people that hasn't have the capacity either to move, neither to feel their legs. And you can see how it is used in a more daily living situation where you use crutches to keep on the balance, and the exoskeleton can provide a motion that is pre-programmed motion. You just need to have a detection, which means you need to tell them, like, now you start the cycle of taking a step. Exo specifically evolved towards rehabilitation, the field that we're discussing a bit more today. And there, what you need to improve first is the way that you control the device, because it's no more the device doing a motion for you. It's more an interaction between the device and the patient. So where we stand, this is a review by Rodriguez Fernandez in 2021, showing that we have about 80 studies on the rehabilitation part of it. And you can see that there's still a main focus on SCI patients, with a bit of stroke patients too, and other that could be elderly people, and mostly multiple sclerosis. What's interesting here is that for different patients, we will have very different things that we will look at. And of course, the application is quite different. So for SCI patients, you can see here the outcomes. The first one is the clinical demonstration of functionality. So it's more to show that people can really use the device and ambulate or walk with it. You can see that 76% of ambulation can be done without assistance, that you have an average walking of 1 kilometer an hour, which is a gait that is super slow. That's still one of a big drawback in daily life mobility, let's say, about exoskeleton. And you had like a few percentage of falls, but with an exoskeleton that could be like quite critical. You also have different medical benefits. That's maybe the most interesting things. And one of the things that would help the most people to transfer into those kind of devices, because usually medical benefits are stronger and more recognized than just quality of life in terms of insurance companies, reimbursements, and things like this. And you can see here that there was a 61% of the patients with bowel improvements, and 40% of the patients with spasticity improvement. So two things that could be quite game-changing for SCI patients. They also look at the different studies done in stroke patients. In stroke patients, then what you do is you're not looking at the functionality of the things. What you do is you're doing a session of rehabilitation for a certain amount of time. And after that time, you look what's the difference between the patients before the rehabilitation with the exoskeleton and his state without the exoskeleton after the rehabilitation process. They show in most of the study a better gait speed, which is an indicator somehow of the independence or quality of gait of the patient. And they show also in general that the combination of the standard physiotherapy plus the robotically assisted might be better than the physiotherapy alone. Most of the time, it's not just the robotically assisted training as a combination with standard physiotherapy still. MS patients, that's something that we also studied that I'm going to show you after. Might be quite interesting. Very few studies so far reported also in this one. They tried only the Kyogo, which is a partial exoskeleton about the knee. And they've shown, strangely, that you have worse results wearing the exoskeleton, which means that you score lower on the 6 minutes walk test, on the TIG and the time steer test. That's also something we're going to discuss, because medical benefits is something. Having better performance with the exoskeleton is also something going in different directions. Now I'm going to tell you a bit more about Autonomio, what we did and where we are going. So our main focus interest first was muscular dystrophy during my PhD, since we had a lot of contact and some sponsored by muscular dystrophy associations. And the first thing that you see is that patients are very, very different. So they may have different weakness, in all of the different joints, that could be the knee, hip, or ankle, you will see very different things. Also on the upper limbs, which makes it quite hard, for example, to use crutches. But what we saw more generally for people with some residual ability and not SCI patients is that you want adaptive assistance. You want full degrees of freedom. Most of the exoskeleton at this time were mostly constraining any abduction of the hip or the ankle and just going straight forward. And you want it to be safe. So those are the points I'll come right now. This is our first prototype of the autonomous exoskeleton. You have 6 actuators here, so 3 for legs on the hip and knee flexion extension, plus on the hip abduction, which allow you to do side steps and move your pelvis tilted, which could be quite interesting. And it was our target to let the ankle almost completely free of doing internal rotation, doing plantar flexion, or doing eversion inversion. Of course, with such a device, what is interesting is that you have multiple integrated sensors. For example, here you have ground reaction force sensor that are measured in the soles. You have all the motion that is given anyway through the motors, through encoders, etc. And you can also have IMU sensors that gives you orientation in space relative to a fixed reference system. I'll show you just the degrees of freedom, which is something important. So you can see on the left the abduction. You can see the standard hip and knee flexion extension in the middle, and rotation around a point, so the vertical axis, let's say, that is quite interesting if you want to change direction. That is not really something that was provided for SCI patients. And finally, one of the biggest topic that we have is to follow the human motion. So to have a synergy where the patient is able to perform the motion as much as he can, and the robot is able to understand that and just apply assistance as needed into following the patient's motion or the wearer motion. What we did in the last 2 years is a clinical feasibility study. So it's a prior study, let's say, so we're not already showing improvements in the rehabilitation sites. That's the next topics that we're gonna tackle. But here we really wanted to demonstrate that it works, and we wanted to see is there some external other benefits that the patients may have with it. We had 3 groups of people, 1 control that is healthy participants. We had 8 MS patients and 6 muscular dystrophy patients. Our main inclusion criteria was that they were able to stand and walk at least 20 meters and still have some strong walking impairment. Otherwise, you don't see, obviously, the impact of it, which on an MS patient would be equivalent to an EDSS scale between 4.5 and 6.5. What we did is 3 sessions, 2 trainings of 1 hour. When we put the patients into the exoskeleton, we tried to tune it a bit so that it fits the best the user. And at the end of the sessions that are separate by 1 week or a bit more, we were doing 1 gait lab when we acquired all the kinematics, comparing what's the kinematic without the exoskeleton and with the exoskeleton. We looked at the muscle contractions with EMG, and that's about it. So what we did as testing, it was a 2-minute walk test to check the comfort, the exertion, the confidence, and the performance of the patients. And we did a 10-meter walk test on the gait lab to check the kinematics and the muscle activity. I think the most interesting thing is to see really what it looks like, because graphs are really nice, but if you can really see how a patient is moving, that tells you maybe a way more. I'm going to show you two patients. The first one is a neuromuscular disease patient. I think it's a limb girdle muscular dystrophy patient. So you can see a lot of weakness in the full body, as much as in the trunk, upper limb, and the lower limbs. You can maybe see that she is wearing AFOs at both ankle. And you can see the difference between, on this 2-minute walk test, between no exo and wearing the exoskeleton. What you don't see and you cannot feel is the amount of exertion that she's having. And the level of exertion is way lower with the exoskeleton. And you can see here, maybe that's also one of the take-home message for us, is that some patients will require more support on the trunk level and on the upper limb, where you see that it's still not taking this, supporting it enough. So how does it detect that the patients want to walk and is doing it? So we have two approaches. The first one is that we look at the velocity at the hip. And when you have a certain hip velocity, so you just have to push a bit the hip for that, it starts taking a step, and it stops also or do the knee extension of the pre-stand space when he sees that the hip is going down or it has lower velocity. The other way we do, and that's the most convenient usually for patients because it's more reactive, is that they have to transfer 80% of their body weight to one of the legs. And when you reach that threshold, the exoskeleton is taking a step with the opposite leg, obviously. More interesting were the results was multiple sclerosis patients. You can see on this patient, for example, that he has a very spastic right knee. So he's not moving much the right leg. And that was very interesting to see whether the exoskeleton would improve, I think, or if the patient would react even more strongly to a force that is trying to bend his knee and go against it. Hopefully we had on this patient specifically, I'll show you the graphs just after, but we had a quite important change in the range of motion at the knee, demonstrating that exoskeleton quite supports well or is quite well compatible with that kind of spasticity in this case. I think other thing, and you can see still quite also interesting in this videos that we are always supporting the patient in this space, which means that the need for a balance or a support for balance is still quite important and required. That's a topic that we can tackle after during the questions also, whether it's interesting to have an exoskeleton that can stand balance by itself or having external support for that. So in general, yeah, here you have a bit of the angles of specifically this patients, where you can see in blue the line without the exoskeleton, and in orange the line with the exoskeleton. You have the left and right hip on top and the left and right knee below. I think I can show you with my pointer. And on the right knee, you can see quite well that the flexion during swing appears thanks to the exoskeleton, and that's a drastic change for that person. You can see in general range of motion during the gait that evolves usually towards, so you have without exo and you have with exo, the left and the right leg each time. And you can see that first, for both of them, you generally increase the range of motion. Of course, I mean, this could be kind of obvious since you are assisted, but that's still something that if people feels insecure, they would tend to do smaller steps, take smaller steps, which means that they could still, even with an assistive device, have lower range of motion. And usually what we also try to identify is whether there is a better symmetry, so less difference between the left and the right legs. And that's something that in most of the cases we can definitely provide and show. So to summarize a bit what we saw during this clinical trial, the first thing is that we have a slower walk with device. So, I mean, the exoskeleton depends also a bit on the performance of the exoskeleton. Our first generation is limited in speed, which has an impact there. But more than that, you also see that with the full equipment, people will tend to have longer stand space to really move their weight to the different support. And in general, we've seen that we are not going to have really improvement in this direction with exoskeleton because people need to feel safer, and they need to do steps more separated, like step by step, instead of trying to have something completely fluid. So safety was something quite okay with hand support, but it means that people will not be able to just walk with an exoskeleton alone. We've seen that exertion is decreased with the use of the exoskeleton. So some patients, they see it slightly. Some persons, especially with MS, they felt like they could walk for hours with an exoskeleton, whereas when they would just walk alone, they would do 5 to 10 minutes before getting exhausted. The range of motion and symmetry, I told about it a bit. And specifically for each group, what we saw is that for the neuromuscular disease group, what you can best provide is a correction of the gait kinematics. They have a large tendency towards adapted gait, so really doing motions that reduce sometimes the costs of walking, etc., and or just for example, what you see very often in this group is hyperextension of the knee, because when your knee is hyperextended during the stand space, it's like you don't need any muscles to put it in place, just using passive behavior to just exert a force. In the multiple sclerosis group, we had one patient, very interestingly, that had a sensation recovery that lasted 2 days just after the sessions. Very interesting. That's not something we're able to explain right now. That could come for an augmented blood flow in the legs. That could be a nerve that is pinched usually, and correcting the motions, get it back to normal. But quite interesting, and definitely the sensation came back with an effect of 48 hours and then back to normal state of the patients, which is not ideal, and quite spasticity compatible as what we've seen there. So quite interesting in this aspect too. and we're just wondering now how to demonstrate further that what's the effect of exoskeleton on spasticity, and could it has long-term effects. So that's it for kind of the clinical part of this first feasibility study that we did. And now I want to explain a bit more what we're doing, in which direction we're going today. Something very interesting is that we see that access to rehabilitation very often is quite limited because it's mostly done in clinics with specialists, but at some point you're released at home, and at home you neither have enough access to enough intensity of training, neither you have access to the same tools. And that limits quite a lot the recovery phase in the second part of it where you're at home. Extensive feedback and monitoring. Of course, if you can have tools that measure and tracks everything that are directly worn by the patients, then you have access to a lot of data that today the physiotherapist cannot really communicate, because it's either purely visual, but if you change physiotherapist, you cannot transfer this experience from one physiotherapist to the other. Of course, the only tool that they have, it's standard tests of 2 minutes walking and see how much time patient is doing, etc. And finally, something that is in the trend and very interesting is the entertaining, is the way of giving exergaming into the rehabilitation. And today we're working with the CHUV Rehabilitation Hospital, or CHUV Hospital in general in Lausanne, and the Swiss Institute of Technology, to bring all those pieces together and have something very interesting. So that's a big project funded by the government in Switzerland, and we're just starting it right now. So looking for what's going to happen next. Just to develop a bit on this solution where you combine a rehabilitation or digital app with an exoskeleton, showing that you can have live feedback, performance metrics, and personalization. That's quite interesting. So the patients is doing tele-rehabilitation. I think that's the next discussion that's going to be also interesting. I don't have to go too much into details, but just to show you finally our vision with the last slides, we are going to, of course, have this exoskeleton directly connected to a rehabilitation app platform. And some elements we're still working on that we're not disclosing too much. So I'm just using some commercial thing already existing, which is the light gate, to show how we're gonna body weight support the user that is gonna use it. And of course, we have many challenges ahead of us, starting with the price of the technology today and going with the will of the patients to use it at home in the different settings that already exist, and going into this digital transformation kind of. Thanks a lot. I think that was my last slide. I hope you understood most of it, and I'm very glad to take on questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Almaric, for this fascinating talk. Was very interesting to see that you've come a long way, and that you had many problems to tackle, many also fascinating new ideas, especially what I like especially is concerning the exogaming research field I'm also taking part in under the supervision of Professor Sokolov, you mentioned in your talk. And of course, also the at-home use. So I think this will be an important part also in the future of rehabilitation, to transfer the rehabilitation from the ward and inpatient consultation and outpatient consultation to at-home use, and also to increase training intensity. With this, I'd like to open the session for questions. Are there any questions or comments from the audience? Or first, I'd like to give the word probably to the invited expert, Professor Cripps. Do you have any input, questions, remarks on the talk of Amelie?
Yes, thanks for inviting me. Also very nice to understand what Amalric is working on. Very, very nice work. But I want to highlight a few things and ask a few things, and maybe this would help others get more courageous and ask also questions. So you mentioned that the recommendation appears that physiotherapy plus exoskeletal training is better than physio alone. But if we would be comparing exoskeleton alone versus physio, we haven't yet shown to be better. In some cases, there is even a debate if we are not less effective. So it's clearly showing that the traditional exoskeletal that had 4 degrees of freedom moving the knee and the hip wasn't actually enough, because physio was doing something else that was adding. And you touch on some of these aspects related to balance. You touch on it by showing also the video, how the therapist was engaging the patient, one of them propelling the patient forward, but the other one taking care of balance and other things. So on this point of view, I'm curious to ask you, you already had gone beyond the traditional one. You have 6 actuated degrees of freedom. So not only you move the hip and knee in one plane, but also you're moving sides. So to what extent you think your device could contribute beyond the traditional 4 degrees of freedom, the traditional, say, rewalk or exo? And what else would you recommend? You mentioned balance, and that's my second point, is to understand, somehow I have a feeling that we need 7 degrees of freedom to self-balance the device, but maybe I'm wrong. So I want to understand why 6, what is giving me beyond the rewalk, and number 2, what you think would be necessary to close the gap of physio plus exoskeletal so that they are more equal, so that we would perhaps limit the need for physio to participate.
Yeah, very good questions, Armando. It's the first one is tackling more how we can improve or go maybe closer towards what a physio could bring in terms to have a more holistic approach. And this is a very interesting, but I guess very difficult question, because what we know today is only what we can provide. And it's very difficult to say, okay, more degrees of freedom would bring the work of more muscles, of more nerve reactions, implications, and help this. Of course, I think the more activities you can do, the more heterogeneous activities you can do, the better. And we would do that. For me, it's not possible today to answer and say, okay, we added the abduction. This will have a very enormous change on what the patient can train and what it can do. What we know is that if you train only walking, of course, then you're very limited in what you're training. And that's maybe one part of the answer. And what we try to go for is having a multiple set of different exercises where you're training to do sit to stand, to do squatting, to do reaching objects further. So working on very various and more complete exercises than just doing walking. It's true that today in the field, medical device tends to be very single operation. So that's quite interesting. I don't know if you want to bounce on that or I go directly for the question and balance.
No, I think that's very much what we also practice or believe. We just like maybe have one step beyond, because we are kind of had created a kind of working model of what we have to train, but not just the rhythmic movement that the previous devices offer, but also like this, what you mentioned, the sit to stand and others that are requiring what we call discrete movements, and that also the balance part. So we maybe did a little more in terms of being a little more clear in separating them in classes of rhythmic, of discrete type of movements, and on balance. And that's what we think we have to train all these facets so that we could get closer. Okay, but that's very much the same that you had mentioned. But it would be interesting to hear about the balance part that you would be the perhaps number two.
Definitely. It was interesting what you mentioned on the balance side, that you would be going minimally for 7 degrees of freedom. I think that's what you mentioned for. Well, I think Bondercraft, another exoskeleton company, they did a very good work on this side on trying to demonstrate what is the minimal number of actuators that you need to perform balance, etc. And they started with an exoskeleton was 10 actuators, and they ended up with 12 actuators, showing that basically they and I still feel like they're missing some actuators in the foot to really be able to better do the motion of the toes of the metatarsus and be more stable. So I think that's where we stand today, and we know that it's a compromise. Either you have to go with the full package and have used 12, 14 actuators, or you try to have something more lightweight, because of course all the motors are quite heavy and you need an external support.
But then, and of course, I'm not trying to probe, because you said that you are coming with your solution and you just show Lightgate here as an example. But the present group that take these devices to the home are normally people that are not very common here in the US, because the kind of lesions that we have are typically high up, like C4, C5, and not lower lesions. So therefore, if you cannot have a good trunk control and arms control, it's very difficult to take these devices home. So you cannot even stand with the present devices if you don't have the arms to point the crutches backwards, because the exoskeleton is going to throw you backwards. So you need to have something to compensate for that. So I'm curious At what point do you think that we could extend the number of, of course, we mentioned the whole number of people that can benefit, but actually our devices presently only go to a very small, slim slice of them. Because so to what extent do you think we are close to extending this and be able to address other people that, for example, would not have that much control of the trunk and the arm?
Yeah, I think that this was more a discussion that we can keep for later, and some thoughts. And I think Elia, if you want to go on with next presentation that is already need to be started, I'm quite happy to leave the floor.
Thank you so much, Ulrich. Are there any other questions from the audience? Maybe while I'm introducing the next speaker, you can also write it down. So the next speaker we have is a good friend, Carl Froilan, a medical doctor from the Philippines. He is a specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation. Did his residency at the Philippine General Hospital and completed it in 2016. Has been a research affiliate at the Institute of Aging and at the National Institute of Health at the University of the Philippines in Manila. Did exchange programs for research in Italy and Poland. Also worked with computer science on research related to technology, and is now a clinical associate professor at the University of the Philippines College of Medicine. Currently, he is still in Toronto in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, on a clinical fellowship in brain medicine at the University of Toronto. He is very experienced in telerehabilitation and leading telerehabilitation initiatives in the Philippines, in his home country, and his talk will be entitled Responding to the Needs of the Time Through Telerehabilitation Experiences of research from a research-limited country. Very happy to have you here, Carl, and looking forward to your talk.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all. Currently, it's 12:51 p.m. here in Toronto. You're right. I'm currently affiliated with the University of Toronto doing Brain Medicine Fellowship. It's a novel interdisciplinary program. It's relatively new. They accept actually trainees from the field of neurology, neurosurgery, physiatry, even geriatric medicine, and also neurosurgery even. I think they're also going to accept people from the pain specialty. Yeah. And I'm going to talk about tele-rehab, but actually I have pre-recorded it beforehand, because I'm not sure if Dr. Elias mentioned it already. Our panel expert cannot unfortunately make it synchronously afterwards, so I had to send her a recording so she can give her inputs. Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Congratulations to Dr. Elia and the whole yWFNR committee for coming up with this event.
Thank you so much. So I would kindly ask Christian to play back the pre-recorded session by Carl. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carl Leochico, and first of all, I would like to thank the Young WFNR for organizing this event and also for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be with you today virtually and share with you one of the things I am passionate about, which is telerehabilitation. The COVID-19 pandemic has really made us aware of the value of remote or virtual patient encounters. And through telerehabilitation, we can actually respond to the needs of people who may be at risk of developing disability or who are already living with some form of disability. In this presentation, I'm going to share with you our humble telerehab experiences in the Philippines. These are my relevant disclosures. Based on the Global Burden of Disease study, about 2.4 billion people are living with disability worldwide, and the prevalence of which has always been highest in low and middle income countries, such as the Philippines. Unfortunately, however, there are a lot of challenges in accessing in-person rehab services even before the COVID pandemic in the Philippines. Given our geographical landscape, which is an archipelago with limited resources and growing population, there's really that worsening imbalance between the number of persons with lived experiences of disability and our local rehabilitation professionals. You can also imagine the challenge of delivering rehab services in person in such a setting. In fact, we only have these average numbers of rehab professionals throughout the country, and they're mostly based in urban areas. And we are really unable to cope with the growing demand for rehabilitation services. Aside from topography and rehab workforce shortage, access and sustainability issues are also aggravated by the direct and indirect costs of rehabilitation services, which in our country are largely out of pocket. And so in order to address these challenges, we came up with a telerehab program in our institution. So even before the pandemic, we already have this in place. We started out as a hub and spoke model. We are the hub composed of the telerehab team, and we have a spoke from a single remote community. And when COVID happened, we were able to further expand the program, the telerehab program, to cater to a lot more patients, this time coming from all over the country, not just from our partner community. Also, since we are a PM&R training institution, we leveraged telerehab to connect the different arms of the department, namely service, training, and research. At the start of the pandemic, we must admit that these three arms were somehow paralyzed until they eventually found common ground in telerehabilitation. So they used telerehab to provide service or to resume service to patients, provide training to residents and students, and also conduct research. In our publication in the American Journal of PM&R, we share the specific steps we took and the lessons we learned in incorporating telerehab in our daily operations amidst the limited resources that we have, inadequate prior telehealth knowledge and training, and also scarce local evidence. If you wish to learn more about our experience, may I invite you to read this article in the American Journal of PM&R. Also, when COVID-19 started, a large proportion of both healthcare providers and consumers were actually unaware of what telerehab is and how they are related to telehealth, telemedicine, telepractice, telecare, digital care, virtual care, and the list goes on. And so many people most likely turned to online resources to learn more about telerehab. However, such differences in terminologies might have created some confusion, especially among those who weren't practicing or who weren't knowledgeable of virtual care prior to the pandemic. At that time, there weren't also a lot of telerehab guidelines or protocols available. And so we did an infodemiological study using Google Trends to examine the global online interest in telehealth, telemedicine, telerehab, and related search terms. In this figure, we see the trends of searches for the words telehealth in blue and telemedicine in red from 2004, when Google Trends started, to our date of search in October 2020. And we found that the frequencies of searches for telemedicine and telehealth actually peaked around March 2020, which coincided with the lockdown in many countries worldwide, including the Philippines. And among the terms synonymous to telerehabilitation or related to telerehabilitation, we found that the word or term telecare in green was the most commonly used or searched term even before the pandemic, until around March 2020, when teletherapy took over. However, we could not ascertain if teletherapy solely referred to rehabilitation services, or they also referred to teletherapy in the field of psychiatry or also in the field of radiology. So there was no way to determine whether teletherapy was only related to rehab. Yeah. Nonetheless, teletherapy was most commonly searched, with teletherapy speech as the most searched related topic. Here, we found also that the frequencies of search for telerehabilitation per se was highest in the Philippines. And this was followed by Austria, Australia, Canada, and Saudi Arabia in the past 10 years. So it seems like many Filipinos were interested in the term telerehab even before the pandemic. And this figure shows that teletherapy was most commonly used in different or in many regions of the world. And probably telerehab was not commonly known because it's relatively emerging or not that commonly used or implemented worldwide. We don't know for sure. Nonetheless, we know that we need to arrive at a consensus across professional societies and even disciplines at the national and international levels in order to operationally define what telerehab is, come up with a agreeable definition, scope, principles, and standards. And coming up with such a consensus may help streamline current or future telerehab guidelines and programs. In our institution, we use the term telerehab or telerehabilitation to refer to virtual consults provided by physiatrists and residents, and also the therapy services provided by the different allied health professionals. And the latest census that we have puts radiculopathy, particularly lumbosacral, as the top one condition of adults seen via telerehab, while ASD is top one for the pediatric population. Among adults, we also see a lot of cases of OA, MSK, stroke, and ABIs through telerehab. And for children, we cater also to ADHD cases, GDD, and CP, among others. Now, in terms of challenges, our challenges may be also similar to the challenges being experienced in other countries who are relatively new to telerehab. And the main issues that we had were actually related to internet connection. We must admit that the Philippines, although we were once tagged as the social media capital of the world, still is among the slowest in terms of internet speeds worldwide. The majority of our indigent patients as well could not afford doing video conferencing, or may not be that knowledgeable in doing video conferencing. Hence, we had to resort to telephone consultations and giving therapy instructions via telephone only, which of course could only do so much in terms of like virtual exam, management, and supervision. Also, we did not have a lot of funding to reimburse the out-of-pocket internet expenses, which were shouldered by residents and therapists who were using their own cellular data and their own mobile phones or electronic gadgets to connect to patients. And we also had inherent limitations of virtual consultation, largely because of the lack of training in doing virtual consultation and therapy prior to the pandemic. Also because of the lack of guidelines to conduct virtual exam for different conditions. We also had problems with catering to a lot of patients in need of rehab services amid the pandemic. And so workload was also difficult. We were catering to 60 to 80 patients a day, and scheduling was also a problem. We also had difficulty adjusting to the electronic medical records and documenting everything in the virtual consult. And we were just starting out actually with the electronic medical record in the hospital during that time when the pandemic began. And it was also a challenge to maintain privacy during virtual consults, especially when you have like unencrypted softwares or applications. We have to understand that majority of our indigent patients did not know how to use Zoom or did not have access to encrypted softwares or applications used for teleconsult. They weren't that knowledgeable in using Viber. They were just mostly using Facebook, which unfortunately, of course, we know is not ideal for a virtual consult due to risk of data privacy concerns. But during that time, during the pandemic, early on, there was nothing we could do but cater to patients in need of our service, regardless of data concerns. However, what we could only do was to educate them of the risks of the virtual care platform chosen, and also obtain their verbal informed consent. But yeah, you can imagine the challenges we faced early on in the pandemic. Also, during that time, we conducted a national survey in order to determine the telerehab perceptions and experiences of physiatrists nationwide. And we found out that a large majority of our respondents admitted to have low baseline telerehab knowledge, skills, and experiences. And we also explored their apprehensions about using telerehab. Majority mentioned that there was limited exam through virtual consultation or through telerehab. They were also concerned about medical legal liability issues, the lack of secure EMR, unreliable internet, data privacy and security issues, and down the line. If you're interested to learn more about our survey, may I refer you to this article in PM&R. Also, we were able to publish a systematic review wherein we looked into the local literature, despite its limited number, and summarized the challenges to the emergence of telerehab in the Philippines. Actually, this was published or included in a research topic or article collection called TeleneuroRehab that was led by our yWFNR Telerehab SIG. Then it was led by Dr. Paolo Tonin, and he was already working with Dr. Annie Hill, our current WFNR Telerehab SIG, and the team. And so in that paper, we were able to summarize the factors hindering telerehab emergence in our country. And we divided the factors into human, organizational, and technical factors. The most common was organizational factors, followed by technical and then human factors. Among the specific factors, it was actually the slow internet speed or limited internet coverage that was most commonly cited in the local literature. And in terms of human factors, it was the skepticism or the lack of acceptance of stakeholders that was most commonly cited. And lastly, in terms of organizational factors, it's the lack of national e-health policies, laws, or regulations that was most commonly cited as a barrier to telemedicine or telerehabilitation. During the pandemic, our residents also could not do the usual in-person data collection for their research requirements. And so most of them, if not all, resorted to conducting online surveys instead. And a lot of the studies were related to virtual care or virtual learning. Eventually, our department was able to come up with a collection of articles published in our Scopus indexed university journal. We really need to see this increase in the number of telerehab publications locally and internationally. And it's really helpful to provide more evidence as we move forward. During the pandemic, we also conducted a pilot study involving community dwelling persons with stroke, who were members actually of our department's stroke support group. And we asked them first what social media platform they were most comfortable with. And they said Facebook. And so we came up with a private group page on Facebook and uploaded a set of video exercises every day for 2 weeks in order to hopefully improve their physical activity level despite community quarantines. And majority of them actually shared positive feedback regarding their telerehab experience. In terms of our questionnaire using the telepractice perceptions questionnaire, we found out that the majority actually had improved perceptions of telerehab after their 2-week experience. And they also had improved physical activity, improved happiness level as well, and adherence to exercise. They also shared their positive experiences in terms of shared supportive and motivating experience with their fellow group members, and better overall health state, and access to the healthcare providers online with reduced unnecessary public exposure. However, the downside was, again, related to internet. It's very interesting, and I'm also happy to share with you that even up to now, so we conducted the study in 2020, but even up to now, the members or the participants of this pilot study are still engaging in the Facebook group page and also in the Facebook group chat that we created for this study. So they remain physically active and socially connected. We also came up with a case report, this time documenting how we evaluated and managed a case of COVID-19 induced vestibular dysfunction. During that time, we couldn't find any protocol to do virtual vestibular exam, for instance, in doing Dix-Hallpike maneuver. And so we documented here our experience and outcomes. Hopefully, it will be published soon. We also collaborated with experts in information technology to come up with a mobile application that actually assesses mobility impairments among children. Here we tap the community, or barangay as we call it, health workers in screening these children in the grassroots level or in the community, in the remote communities, to provide baseline data which will be relayed to the physiatrists for further assessment. So essentially, we were empowering the community health workers to detect children in their areas who are in need of mobility devices. We also had another application, aside from the Power app, that detects mobility impairments. Now, the Actibu app, or Active in English, now caters to children with other forms of disability using this like online screening form. This leads to early identification, referral, and intervention of children with various forms of disabilities. Also, we partnered with engineers to come up with a prototype that's locally made and inexpensive that can do remote monitoring of patients doing cardiovascular exercises in the comfort of their homes. Here, they were doing a leg ergometer exercise. And well, the pilot study is currently underway, and we hope to share with you our results soon. Finally, we are also coming up with this educational program called APRES Plus, wherein we collaborate with Austria in developing a program that will educate stroke care providers in doing rehabilitation and telerehabilitation. So it's like the trainers program, wherein we train different levels of stakeholders, from doctors, the different healthcare providers or specialties, and also the allied health professionals of different disciplines, and then the community health workers and the families and caregivers of patients suffering from stroke. And we teach them basic principles and strategies of stroke rehabilitation. Of course, this is in the context of only limited rehab professionals that we have nationwide. And so we need more active involvement of those who care for patients with stroke to prevent complications and disability. Now, in terms of future directions, we hope we can have like a national interdisciplinary tele-rehab guideline. We understand that at the start of the pandemic, different specialty or professional societies came up with their own respective guidelines in providing virtual care, but it might be useful to also come up with like a cohesive interdisciplinary guideline that would integrate the different approaches of these different specialty or professional societies. And yeah, we need to create like a cohesive guideline that could define tele-rehab definition or tele-rehab scope of services, appropriate use criteria, process, the benefits, limitations, even regulatory issues, risk mitigation measures, even costing, and implications for third-party payers. Yeah, and I think the key is interdisciplinary collaboration. We need inputs from various stakeholders. So yeah, we also hope to provide more education and training on tele-rehabilitation. Here in our article in the American Journal of PM&R, we proposed a crash course or a short bridging course to augment our prior lack of tele-rehab knowledge, skills, and experiences. So here we shared our short course tele-rehab curriculum that we employed for our staff, residents, and therapists in the department when we started our tele-rehab program. A huge gap also exists in the local evidence of tele-rehab in the Philippines, and I think even internationally. And so here in our article, we summarized the different areas of research related to tele-rehab that we can focus on. Number one is research on tele-rehab stakeholders, such as referring to their readiness and acceptance, knowledge and skills, standard eligibility criteria for patients who can receive tele-rehab, capacity assessment and training of tele-rehab providers, establishing standards as well can be an area of research. Also, we can study on tele-rehab assessments and interventions. Now, this time, investigating the validity and reliability of remotely conducted assessments, the effectiveness and standardization of tele-rehab protocols for common conditions, like determining their treatment dosages, and also to develop low-cost tele-rehab technologies and determine costs of implementation. And lastly, we also need to study about tele-rehab outcomes. For instance, the appropriateness of remotely administered functional scales, measurement of QOL before and after tele-rehab, quality assessment of the services we provide virtually. That's an area of research as well. Client satisfaction, cost effectiveness, and of course, safety assessment. And lastly, we hope to include tele-rehab or telemedicine in academic curricula, starting from the undergraduate level and up the ladder. And hopefully we can have greater internet bandwidth and have more government support for technologies that can be used in telerehabilitation, especially in remote areas. So with that, thank you very much for your kind attention. And I would like to acknowledge the people I work with in the hospitals that I collaborate with in terms of telerehabilitation. I'd be happy to hear your insights, thoughts, or any inquiries you may have. Thank you very much again.
Hello, I'm Dr. Annie Hill. Thank you very much for asking me to be part of the panel for this talk delivered by Carl. I'm sorry that I can't be online, but 3:30 in the morning is not my best time. Carl, I would like to thank you very, very much for doing this talk. You have been extremely busy and the work is truly impressive, so thank you. My first comment is that I agree with you in terms of there being a need to perhaps define some of the terms that we use within this field of work. Tele-rehabilitation, tele-rehab, teletherapy, telecare. And I'm sure that it's very difficult for people who are new to this area, as well as our patients that we serve, when we have all of these different terms. So I do see value in potentially coming together and trying to agree on what certain terms mean. I have a couple of questions. So you talked about there being a number of challenges to delivering care via tele during COVID, and you actually said that many services were actually delivered by phone. And I'm sure that we can all see that there are some services that are not very well suited to being delivered via phone. I guess my question is, now that we're 3 years into COVID, the world has changed. I guess the general public potentially have used video conferencing a little bit more now. Do you think that if we needed to suddenly flip again, that things would be different now, or do we still have work to do in that area? I'd be very keen to hear your thoughts on that. I'm guessing that you're going to pause now so that Carl can answer that, but I'll just move on to the next slide.
Okay. Dr. Elia, can I answer?
Sure, go right ahead.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Annie, even though she's not here, for being with us even asynchronously. See, that's the good thing about tele. You can be flexible, right? And with that being said, that's what we did in telerehab in the Philippines. We needed to be flexible to address the challenges to delivering rehab care, even before, during, and possibly even after the pandemic. We just really have to be flexible. I agree with Dr. Hill. There are a lot of human, organizational, and technical factors that might have been addressed in the past 3 years since the pandemic began. But there are still a lot more work that has yet to be done. For instance, in terms of human factors, I agree with Dr. Hill that many people, both healthcare providers and consumers, have become more aware about the value of telerehab or telemedicine in general. But they may still have enduring concerns or apprehensions that need to be yet addressed. For instance, there are the limitations in virtual examination. As I've mentioned in my talk, we need to conduct more studies to validate examination techniques done through teleconsults. We need to standardize tests virtually, by phone, or by video. And in terms of organizational factors, another huge issue that remains unaddressed is the clarifications regarding telemedicine or telerehab policies and standards in different countries. There's no binding standard for telerehab around the world. So it really has to be individualized per country depending on their resources, right? And their needs. So what are the liabilities of telerehab practitioners? That's a common apprehension among providers. What are the standards of care expected of a quality and equitable telerehab service? What are the rights of patients and what are the limitations to those rights? What are the responsibilities of patients and their families when they engage in telerehab? And lastly, in terms of technical factors, still there are internet issues in many parts of the world, especially in limited resource settings. So access to technology is another issue. I envy countries with very advanced telerehab technologies or equipment. How I wish we had that one in the Philippines. I can only see these when I attend international conferences and and also attend webinars like this. Another issue is the lack of access to encrypted telemedicine softwares that will protect data privacy. Of course, for now, we initially, relied on the applications that our patients, indigent mostly, that they're comfortable with, such as Facebook. But eventually we had to we had to teach them step by step on how to use other platforms like WhatsApp, which is encrypted, or Viber, which is encrypted, other better platforms than Facebook. And if needed, we also had to teach them step by step on how to use video conferencing like Zoom, because we had to virtually examine them by video for a better assessment. However, I understand that Zoom has to be purchased for healthcare, so that is an issue as well. It's not that encrypted. Another issue is how will we ensure efficiency and cost effectiveness in telerehab services? There are more and more patients as time goes by, but our manpower remains limited. We also need more people trained to do tele that is effective and time efficient. We cannot spend hours on one patient doing tele, but residents can do that because they're still in training, so they're not efficient in doing teleconsultations. Even therapists, like the students doing therapy. We also need to do more training and prepare future clinicians, whether doctors or therapists, so they can be prepared for another lockdown or for another pandemic or crisis or disaster in the future. Yeah, so there's still a lot of work to do, Dr. Hill. And I actually published recently an article entitled Telerehab in a Developing Country Toward the Tail End of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Is it here to stay? So I'll post probably the link in the chat box later. And what I mentioned there was that there remains a call to address the challenges and improve the conduct of telerehab, especially in lower middle income countries, if telerehab will continue to stay, because we do not want to waste the efforts done by different sectors, right? The efforts that we've made over the past 3 years that highlighted the benefits of telerehab. And as my last sentence, probably, I think we all need to come together, either virtually or in person, in order to exchange experiences so as to avoid reinventing the wheel or starting from scratch. We can learn from each other and, if possible, share each other's experiences and resources as much as possible. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't know if we have a continuation of the video by Annie Hill, if she has any other question. Yeah.
My other question was around the notion of privacy and security. And you talked about this being a major concern for patients, providers, services, governments, etc. And it is. So certainly if systems such as Facebook are being used, then you can see why certain governments or providers might not feel comfortable with that. I guess my question is, do you think that there's a role for us, for our SIG, or perhaps it's broader, maybe it's health departments or others, to actually lobby companies such as Facebook to improve their level of security? I'm not sure whose role it is, so I'd be keen to hear your thoughts about that and about how we might start to actually address this. What would be a good place to start?
Oh, okay. Yeah, yes, definitely, Dr. Hill. We all need to advocate, I think, for data privacy, especially to these popular social media platforms, not just Facebook, but also Viber, WhatsApp, various video conferencing applications like Zoom, as I mentioned. It's not free for healthcare purposes, right? And Google Meet, and if possible, make them free for indigent patients. And resource-limited healthcare settings. In my opinion, I think we can start where we are at. For instance, I'm a clinician and a researcher and also a teacher. We can do more research to provide more evidence related to the need for action from these social media platforms. Like in our institution, we initially used Facebook for our stroke support group because they were used to Facebook, and that's the only thing we could leverage at that time for the purpose of equality and inclusion, right? We cannot deny these patients tele-rehab service just because they are unable to connect to us in ways other than Facebook. And what we could do that time was to educate them on ways to minimize data privacy risks. Like, for instance, staying in one private room if possible, but that's hard in Manila, given the limited resources and the nature of homes in the Philippines. It's usually co-inhabitation, like different families of different generations in one home in some settings, and the spaces are very limited as well. So how can you maintain privacy when you can hear conversations from another room or in another area of that so limited room? So homes are crowded, spaces are limited. So we could only do so much. And for healthcare providers, I've mentioned in my talk that some were using their own personal accounts to contact patients. So probably we need to educate them that they should avoid using their personal social media accounts when contacting patients or their personal numbers. Inactivate their caller ID when calling patients, not texting from their personal number or emailing from their personal email address. Probably they should have a dedicated email address account or a dedicated work phone. And this has to be escalated to the administrators who can provide financial support to the staff or to the workforce. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, and it could be done in different levels.
Absolutely agree with your point, Carl. Thank you very much. The last question from Annie, and then a short answer also from Carl, and then because we're also already past time, yeah, if you could just play back the question, dear Krista.
My final comment is just that your various papers, such as your systematic review, the various trials that you've done, and then the development of all of those amazing apps is truly impressive. And we thank you for driving this with such energy. Thank you very much, Carl. And finally, I'd just like to give a plug for our SIG. So if people in the audience would like to join our tele-rehabilitation SIG, which is part of the yWFNR, you'd be very welcome. Carl is the secretary, and so if you get in touch with him, he'll add you to our mailing list. Our first meeting for 2023 is on Tuesday, the 7th of March at 12 noon Central European Time via Zoom, and we'll be sending that link out soon. At that meeting, we'll be talking about the aims for our SIG and what work we would like to do together. So I hope to see some of you there. Again, thank you very much, Carl. Bye.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Also, thank you to Dr. Hill for recording her questions. Very nice way to solve the problem like this with the time zone. Thank you all for attending the webinar. I'd like to conclude it with this talk, and thank you, Carl, as well, for your absolutely tremendous work. Very impressive, and yeah, you have been very busy, as Dr. Hill mentioned. And yeah, hope to see you on May 3rd to the next research webinar. Bye, guys. Take care. And thank you also for Christian for recording. Thanks.
Thank you, Elia. Have a good night.